Hello, everyone. Today we're going to look at the end of World War I and the beginning of the interwar period that gets kicked off with the Treaty of Versailles and all of the geopolitical changes that happen as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So as we look at the final phase of World War I, a critical question emerges. Why did Germany ultimately surrender in November of 1918? This wasn't a simple decision, but rather the culmination of several devastating factors. By autumn 1918, Germany's situation had become increasingly desperate. The German military leadership recognized that victory was no longer possible. When the Allies launched their 100 Days offensive in August, German forces began a steady retreat. But military setbacks were just part of the story. Inside Germany, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The British naval blockade had strangled the German economy, leading to severe food shortages. In what Germans called the turnip winter of 1916-17, people were literally surviving on turnips when potatoes and grain became unavailable. By 1918, German civilians were facing starvation. Adding to this crisis, a deadly new enemy arrived, the influenza pandemic of 1918, also known as the Spanish flu, which further weakened both German military and the civilian population. The political situation was also collapsing. Germany's allies were surrendering one by one. Bulgaria in September, the Ottoman Empire in October, and Austria-Hungary in early November. Germany found itself increasingly isolated. Uprisings began to spread across Germany, with workers and soldiers forming councils and demanding peace. Facing military defeat, starvation at home, a pandemic, abandonment by allies, and revolution within their own borders, the German leadership had little choice. Its leaders recognized that continuing the war would only lead to more suffering and potentially a complete societal collapse. So on November 11th, 1918, Germany signed the armistice, bringing the fighting to an end. On November 9th, 1918, just 2 days before the armistice, Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated his throne and fled to the neutral Netherlands. In the wake of his abdication, Germany was declared a republic, the Weimar Republic, representing a complete transformation of Germany. Now that we understand why Germany surrendered, let's examine the peace treaty that formally ended World War I and its devastating consequences for Germany. On June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand that triggered the war, the Treaty of Versailles was signed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. This was a pivotal moment in history, but it's crucial to understand that Germany had virtually no say in the terms of the treaty. They were invited to the peace negotiations and were ultimately presented with an ultimatum: sign the treaty or face renewed war. At the heart of the treaty was Article 231, commonly known as the War Guilt Clause. This article forced Germany to accept complete responsibility for causing the war. Imagine how this felt to the German people, being told that they alone were responsible for a conflict that had involved numerous countries with complex imperial rivalries and alliance systems. This perceived injustice fueled what became known as the stab-in-the-back myth. It's important to remember that Germany didn't surrender because its territory had been invaded or Berlin captured. German troops were still fighting on foreign soil when the armistice was signed. Many German soldiers began to believe that they hadn't been defeated militarily, but had instead been betrayed by civilians and politicians at home. This narrative was particularly powerful because it offered an explanation that preserved German military honor while placing the blame on the new Weimar Republic government, Jews, communists, and other groups. Based on this assignment of guilt, the treaty imposed enormous financial penalties. Germany was required to pay the equivalent of $33 billion in reparations, and that was in 1919. In today's dollars, that would be the equivalent of $605 billion. This was an astronomical sum designed to cripple Germany economically for generations. When Germany fell behind on these payments in 1923, France and Belgium responded by occupying the industrial Ruhr Valley region. French troops literally took control of German factories, mines, and railways to extract resources as payment. This occupation was deeply humiliating for Germans and further destabilized their economy. Germany's massive debt obligations and the loss of industrial resources placed an insurmountable financial burden on Germany. The government's response was obviously to print more money, print more currency, which in turn devalued the German mark, leading to economic turmoil and one of history's most notorious cases of hyperinflation. By late 1923, German currency became virtually worthless. There are famous photos of people using wheelbarrows full of money to buy a loaf of bread, or children playing with stacks of worthless bills as building blocks. At its peak, prices were doubling every 3.7 days. Imagine your savings becoming worthless in a matter of weeks. The German middle class was essentially wiped out. What we see here is a devastating chain reaction. The war guilt clause led to massive reparations, which Germany could not pay, which in turn led to the Ruhr occupation, which triggered hyperinflation, which then destroyed the economy and undermined faith in democracy itself. This created fertile ground for extremist political movements that promised to restore German pride and prosperity. The Treaty of Versailles was intended to ensure peace by weakening Germany. Instead, as we will see, it created conditions of such humiliation and economic suffering that it helped set the stage for an even more devastating conflict 2 decades later. Beyond Germany's borders, the Treaty of Versailles fundamentally transformed the map of Europe and reshaped large portions of the world. These changes were profoundly influenced by American President Woodrow Wilson's idealistic vision outlined in his famous 14 Points for Peace speech delivered in January 1918. Wilson's 14 points proposed a new international order based on open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade, disarmament, and most crucially, the principle of national self-determination, the revolutionary idea that people should choose their own governments based on ethnic and cultural identity. This vision captured the imagination of many oppressed nationalities and initially shaped the peace negotiations. The cornerstone of Wilson's plan was the establishment of the League of Nations, an international organization designed to prevent future wars through collective security and diplomatic negotiation. The League, created by Part 1 of the Treaty of Versailles, represented humanity's first attempt at a permanent global peacekeeping organization. Wilson believed it would transform international relations from power politics to a system based on law and cooperation. In Central and Eastern Europe, the principle of self-determination led to dramatic changes. 4 major empires collapsed: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires. From their territories emerged numerous new nation-states. Poland was recreated after being partitioned for over a century. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia emerged as new multi-ethnic states. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland gained independence from Russia. However, the application of self-determination proved inconsistent. Creating perfectly homogeneous nation-states was impossible in regions with intermingled populations. The new borders left significant minorities in many countries: Germans in Czechoslovakia, Hungarians in Romania, and various ethnic groups in Yugoslavia. These embedded ethnic tensions would resurface later with devastating consequences. Outside Europe, Wilson's principles were even more thoroughly compromised. In the Middle East, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire led to momentous changes that prioritized imperial interests over self-determination. The secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 had already mapped out how Britain and France would divide Ottoman territories between themselves. After the war, they implemented this plan through what was known as the Mandate System. The Mandate System, established under Article 22 of the League of Nations, was theoretically created to prepare former German and Ottoman territories for eventual self-rule. In reality, it functioned as colonialism with a new name. The League granted mandates to the victorious powers to administer these territories. France received Syria and Lebanon. Britain took Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. These artificially created borders ignored tribal, religious, and ethnic realities on the ground. It's interesting to note the racism and stench of white man's burden from the mandate system in the Treaty of Versailles. If you look at the second bullet here, it said these areas are inhabited by peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world. The tutelage of such peoples should be entrusted to the advanced nations. So there's really still a very, very strong imperialist tone to this treaty. In Africa, Germany's colonies were similarly distributed through the mandate system with little regard for indigenous preferences. In Asia, Japan emerged as a major beneficiary. Having joined the Allies, Japan was granted Germany's concessions in China's Shandong Peninsula and received mandates over former German Pacific islands. This expansion of Japanese power alarmed the Chinese, who had also fought on the Allied side but received little benefit at Versailles. China's sense of betrayal erupted in their May 4th movement, a nationalist protest that profoundly influenced Chinese politics. What we see in all these territorial changes is a fundamental contradiction. Wilson's idealistic vision of self-determination and a new international order based on cooperation through the League of Nations was compromised by the practical realities of power politics and imperial interests. The other Allied powers, particularly France, sought security against future German aggression, and Britain, looking to expand its imperial reach, ensured that the final settlement served their strategic objectives. The League of Nations, Wilson's great hope for preventing future wars, was further undermined when the United States Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, meaning the United States never even joined the organization it had helped create. This absence significantly weakened the League's effectiveness from the start. Let's end this video by examining two critical but often overlooked aspects of the war: its impact on India's relationship with Britain and the notorious Armenian genocide, both examples of how the war transformed existing power structures and ethnic relations around the world. India played a crucial role in World War I that is frequently forgotten in Western accounts. As part of the British Empire, India contributed enormously to the Allied war effort. Over 1.3 million Indian soldiers and laborers served overseas. They fought in some of the war's most brutal battlefields, from the trenches of the Western Front to the deserts of Mesopotamia and the mountains of Gallipoli. By the war's end, nearly 74,000 Indian troops had died in service. This massive contribution fundamentally altered India's relationship with Britain. Before the war, the Indian independence movement, was relatively limited in scope. After the war, it transformed into a mass movement. Why is that? Indian soldiers had fought to defend liberty and self-determination, the very values the Allies claimed to champion. When they returned home, they expected these principles would apply to India as well. Additionally, Britain had made promises of greater self-government to secure Indian support during the war. But post-war reforms fell far short of these expectations. Disappointment turned to outrage after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in April of 1919, also known as the Amritsar massacre, when British troops fired on unarmed demonstrators in Amritsar, killing hundreds. This event shocked the Indian population and galvanized the independence movement. Mahatma Gandhi launched his first major non-cooperation campaign shortly afterward, marking a new phase in India's struggle for independence. What began as loyal service to the empire during the war evolved into a determined movement for freedom that would ultimately succeed 3 decades later. At the same time, in the Ottoman Empire, the war provided cover for one of history's most horrific atrocities, the Armenian Genocide. As the Ottoman Empire entered the war on Germany's side, its political leadership, dominated by the Young Turk movement, became increasingly suspicious of the empire's Armenian Christian minority, whom they viewed as potential allies of Russia. Beginning in 1915, the Ottoman government initiated a systematic campaign to eliminate the Armenian population. Government officials, military officers, and irregular forces rounded up Armenian leaders, deported entire communities from their historic homelands in eastern Anatolia, and subjected them to forced marches through the Syrian desert without adequate food or water. Those who survived the marches faced confinement in concentration camps. Through direct killing, starvation, dehydration, and disease, an estimated 1 to 1.5 million Armenians died. Reports of these atrocities reached the Allied powers during the war. In May 1915, the governments of France, Britain, and Russia issued a joint statement denouncing the crimes against humanity and civilization, one of the first uses of this phrase that would later become central to international law. After the war, the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 between the Allied powers and Turkish leaders initially held out the possibility of justice for Armenians, including an independent Armenian state. However, the rise of Turkish nationalism under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk led to the treaty's rejection. The Armenian Genocide established a horrific precedent that would cast a long shadow over the 20th century. Yet despite its scale and documentation by international observers, the perpetrators largely escaped justice in the post-war settlement. This absence of accountability would not go unnoticed. In 1939, just 1 week before invading Poland and initiating the Holocaust, Adolf Hitler reportedly reassured his generals about the world's response to their planned atrocities by asking, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Hitler, who had been a corporal in the German army during World War I, had carefully studied not only the Armenian Genocide, but also the entire post-war settlement.